Today, we're going to dive into a series of really raw, unfiltered online conversations. They tell the story of one person's search for a safe place to land and how that digital sanctuary actually became the very source of his public breakdown. We're going to trace this whole thing, step by step, to understand not just what happened, but why. And at the heart of this whole story is a man named Alberto. This one quote from one of his late night chats really sets the emotional stage for everything. This isn't just some throwaway comment. It's a desperate plea, and it becomes the central theme of his entire online journey. He's looking for one thing above everything else. So, that brings us to our first big question. When you're looking for peace in a world that is so loud and digital, where do you even go? We're going to explore this really fundamental human need for a sanctuary, and why certain corners of the internet can feel like the only safe place left. To really get Alberto's journey, you first have to understand this idea of a digital safe zone. Now, this is an online space that just feels insulated, away from judgment. And what's weird is that the chaos and the noise of these places can actually make someone feel hidden and safe, creating a space for truly raw, open communication. And that's exactly the pull for someone like Alberto. I mean, when you're feeling vulnerable, which he clearly was, these unfiltered communities, like on Twitter Spaces, they promise connection. They feel like a place where you can finally let your guard down, say what you really think, and find that community and that peace you've been looking for. But here's the thing, right? As we're about to see, even a sanctuary can have its fractures. We're going to look at the exact moments when communication just completely fell apart, turning what was supposed to be a safe space into a source of real conflict. Okay, so this slide right here captures a really painful moment of misinterpretation. Over on the left, you've got Alberto trying to express gratitude, affection. He's saying, hey, our time together was beautiful, it meant something to me. But then look at how it was received on the right, as a total accusation, that he was calling their time a waste. It's just a perfect example of how wires can get crossed in a really, really personal way.
And this is how Alberto looked back on that moment. For him, this wasn't just some simple misunderstanding. No, he felt the way his words were twisted was actually malicious. And this just goes to show how a tiny crack in communication can feel like a direct personal attack, and it sets the stage for much bigger fights down the road.
And that brings us to the absolute core of the breakdown. In this section, we're going to see how those small cracks just blew wide open into an all-out onslaught. This is the point where a simple miscommunication spirals into a relentless, targeted campaign of harassment. Alberto used this incredibly visceral phrase to describe how the attacks felt. It wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was just a constant barrage. He felt like he was being digitally beaten down, day in and day out, by one person in particular. And the harassment took on this really repetitive, mocking tone. As Alberto tells it here, it was just the same taunts over and over and over again. This relentless repetition was designed to wear him down. And as he says himself, it just became completely overwhelming. And this is the result. This is what someone sounds like when they are at their absolute breaking point. After weeks of this abuse, Alberto is just left pleading for it to stop, asking out loud if the whole point is to make him collapse. This wasn't just online drama anymore. This had a severe, real-world impact. So let's shift our focus for a minute. Let's move from the attacks themselves to the consequences. This next part is all about the deep psychological toll this online harassment took on Alberto and how it started to bleed into his actual everyday life. Over hours and hours of recordings, Alberto basically documents the damage himself. He talks about severe anxiety, the kind that leads to panic attacks, a growing paranoia that made him terrified to even open his DMs. He constantly felt like he was on the verge of collapse. And so importantly, he recognized that his own vulnerability was exactly what made him such an easy target. These are not abstract ideas. These are the real scars left by digital aggression. So all of this leads to a pretty critical question. We've seen what happened, but we haven't really gotten to the why of it all. What makes somebody so susceptible to this kind of online campaign? Why did these specific attacks hit him so incredibly hard? Well, in our final section, we are going to find the answer. And it turns out the key to understanding why Alberto was so vulnerable, it's not in these recent Twitter fights at all. It's actually a ghost from his past. See, the real reason this harassment was so incredibly damaging is rooted in an event that happened years earlier. It was a public trauma that basically created the exact sensitivities his online attackers would later, maybe unknowingly, exploit. And here it is, the revelation. Years ago, Alberto was arrested, and he talks about how the media just completely destroyed him. They didn't just report the facts, they painted this image of him as a cyber terrorist, the worst of the worst. He was publicly demonized, with absolutely no way to defend himself. And this is the final piece of the puzzle. That past trauma of having his identity hijacked and twisted into something monstrous by a powerful story he couldn't control. It created this deep, deep vulnerability. So when he was targeted again years later on Twitter, the attacks weren't just insults. For him, they were a horrifying echo of his worst trauma, bringing back that same feeling of being publicly destroyed all over again. Alberto's story is such a powerful case study, but it leaves us with a much bigger question, one that really affects all of us. He went online looking for peace, but instead he found a battlefield that just mirrored his deepest traumas. And it really forces us to ask, in a world where so much of our lives are lived online, how do we truly find and protect our own peace?